Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into my show, William Wallace for America. I am William Wallace, and with me today is Elizabeth Franklin Best. Today's show is going to be one of my most interesting shows. I've really been excited about it because, as you all know, I love the Second Amendment, staunch supporter of it. But when I was researching some things, you always find that there's lots of different entanglements, we'll say, lots of blurred lines when it comes to our rights. How Second Amendment are you? What you believe in, what you believe your rights are, where are our rights in? There's lots of gray areas. And you'll always hear me saying that bureaucracy oftentimes gets in the way of a lot of our rights. And I think that the Second Amendment is another one of those. So I found, or was presented to me, we'll say Elizabeth Franklin Best. Thank you for being on today. Um, and she has some really interesting things to talk about, which I think you're going to see for yourself. But let me just set it up for 1 second that you, I'm not advocating for criminals to have guns. However, what defines a criminal, and at what point is a criminal or should a criminal not be allowed to have their Second Amendment rights? And the cases that Elizabeth is handling, I think, are going to help define where those areas are or show you how blurred the lines are. And we're going to talk about this in a way that I think it's going to enlighten you on the case that she's working on. Elizabeth, thank you so much. I appreciate you for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's pretty exciting to be here and to meet you.
Appreciate that. Well, I got to tell you, reading through some of the type of cases, when you told me 2255, I looked it up and I'm like, what's a 2255? And then I started reading some examples and my eyes opened up. And we're going to
Mhm.
talk about your case and name the person Fred. So,
Okay.
what is first of what is a 2255?
Okay.
And then how much can you tell about Fred's case in that
Okay.
2255?
Okay. 2255 motion is for federal inmates, people who have been convicted of federal crimes. Once they have a direct appeal, which usually just sort of raises issues of law that may have arisen like over the course of their trial or their plea. Once they lose that, they have an additional remedy, which is called the 2255. And in a 2255, it's called like a collateral challenge to the conviction. And there's certain kinds of claims that you generally see arise in 2255s. So, for example, ineffective assistance of counsel claims, prosecutorial misconduct, things that are not sort of readily apparent from the record of the first proceeding. But also, the 2255 is a vehicle for inmates to be allowed to take advantage of recent United States Supreme Court case law, so long as it's substantive and the Supreme Court makes it retroactive. And so, if you're not a criminal defendant, you probably aren't really, too familiar with all of this. But I promise you that all the guys in federal and federal institutions are. A few years ago, United States Supreme Court came down with a case called United States versus Johnson, and that declared a certain part of a statute to be unconstitutionally vague. And so a number of inmates were able to file 2255 petitions asking the Supreme Court to please sort of reconsider their sentence in light of that new United States Supreme Court case. And they did so. I mean, that's just sort of the vehicle you use to get that kind of benefit. And so, some people had their sentences modified, now the rest of it. So that is just sort of the broad outline of what a 2255 is. So the case that you're talking about,
We'll
what
call him
we've been
Fred.
doing, Fred, for Fred's case. So back in June of this last year, the United States Supreme Court came out with a case, New York State Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruin. And in it, it was a 6-3 opinion authored by Justice Clarence Thomas. And it really has sort of expanded. I mean, it's more than expanded. I mean, it has just sort of changed the landscape.
Clarence Thomas is still mad about that, right?
I'm sorry, who?
Clarence Thomas is still mad about some things about that, right?
he's he's got yes. Um, yeah. So when this came out, I mean, it's really just changed the framework in which courts are supposed to be analyzing Second Amendment regulations. And so it comes out. I mean, it's a very impactful case. I mean, the holding itself is not so unusual. It's just the new test that they initiated in this case that really sort of makes this a monumental case. The holding in it is kind of an extension of what we had in Heller. Heller first found, and this was the District of Columbia versus Heller case, I think it was 2010, that for the first time sort of recognized a First Amendment, I'm sorry, an individual right to own and possess firearms. I mean, that had been sort of percolating in the academic literature, but this was the first time the United States Supreme Court said it's an individual right.
And it
And
wasn't there like three main principles to Heller. It was one is individual right, the second was usual firearms, and the third was right for self-defense. Correct?
yes, yes. I mean,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and so the self-defense piece is still kind of at the heart of Bruin. But where Bruin sort of extends on Heller is it says, not only do you have the right to own and bear a firearm in your home for purposes of self-defense, but you can also do it outside of the home. And restrictions that would curtail that, are going to have to meet this new test. And the new test is not a balancing test, which is what the courts throughout the country were doing, like in light of Heller. They were saying, oh, okay, so, we have to recognize that people have this right to the firearms, but we're going to balance that against a government's interest in, for example, like public safety. So Bruin gets rid of the balancing test. And now, sort of the project is to look back to what the framers, what their reality was
Mhm.
at the time that the Second Amendment came into existence, and sort of see whether or not they would have regulated this particular kind of conduct.
And I
And
guess
if they,
let me get. Well, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I was going to
No,
say, and
you.
if there were no regulations for that particular kind of conduct, then it's unconstitutional.
And
So
even
it's a,
today, don't.
oh,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry. No, and
No,
even
no, no.
today, I'm kind of bouncing off what you're saying because even today, don't when they argue cases, don't they look back to what laws were present before 1791, the ratification of the Constitution? When they look back and say what laws were in statute or what laws are written in the individual states at that time as to what we can apply to today. Isn't there some balance on that?
I mean, there's really no balance, right? I mean, that they sort of look back to the evidence, the record
Hmm.
evidence, to decide whether or not this was something that was, sufficiently of concern to the framers. And I mean, how did they address it? So, for example, just recently, the Fifth Circuit came down with an opinion that held that, um, and I haven't read the full opinion yet, but I'm aware of his holding. But in that case, there was a gentleman who had convictions for um, criminal domestic violence. And so I think he had like a felon in possession of a firearm or something like that, some restriction on his right to carry and bear arms based on that criminal domestic violence conviction. And so the Fifth Circuit said, look, at the time of the framers, at the time the Constitution came into existence, I mean, criminal domestic violence wasn't a thing. And in fact, it really wasn't until the 1970s. Therefore, the prescription against him being allowed to carry a firearm was unconstitutional. And so, of course, this is met with a lot of backlash, right? I mean, this
Right.
guy, sort of dangerous, frankly. I mean, it looks like he's got
Right.
kind of a record of, other sort of actions that are problematic. But I mean, where Bruin has kind of gotten us today is that the Fifth Circuit is not empowered to conduct that kind of balancing, that governmental balancing test that people had been doing from, since the time of Heller up until the time of Bruin. And a lot of courts, I think, are kind of beginning to grapple with this. There are challenges like what I'm raising in this particular case, percolating throughout the country. for, all sorts of different kind of firearms type legislation and enhancements and federal sentencing. I mean, really sort of
Right.
it's very pervasive issue. And courts are, we're going to be litigating Second Amendment issues like, I mean, we've just never seen in this country
And if they
before.
have further restrictions on our Second Amendment rights, we'll probably see even more, not only more litigation, but more in-depth litigation. But what I think is a good time to make this or point this out or shine the light on it is that, people, I think, when they see cases like this that we're going to talk about in a minute, or Second Amendment cases, they think, okay, you got the Second Amendment. They don't realize how far back attorneys are going before the ratification of the Constitution to find out what laws that pertained to the Second Amendment were on the books at that time and how that
Mhm.
pertains to today, while still being able to apply somebody's constitutional rights today, to the situation. Is that kind of a
Yeah, I mean, that's completely fair, right? And this has been one of the criticisms of the opinion. It's that, look, I mean, we're lawyers, right? We're not historians. But now, in order to kind of
yeah,
bring these challenges, you have to argue about the Statute of Northampton and, I mean, just, the constitutional conventions. And, I've been very fortunate in that I'm kind of, hooked in with a group of federal public defenders who are really kind of doing the heavy lifting on some of this historical analysis. And so, what I'm doing is I'm reading a lot of what they're collecting. I've got some original sources myself, just trying to kind of make the best arguments I can on behalf of my clients. At the end of the day, this is going to have to be resolved by the United States Supreme Court.
you know,
But the cases are now sort of in the district court level. I mean, this
right.
opinion only came out, 8 months ago. So a lot of people are filing in the district court levels. They're eventually going to make it up to the circuit courts, like this Fifth Circuit opinion, and then eventually, it's going to make it up to the Supreme Court. We're going to have more
What's interesting
clarification.
what's interesting when you talk about these different courts, and I want to point out a couple of your qualifications, is that as I was looking at your bio, you're, I guess, licensed to practice law in a lot of or is it licensed, the right way to say it, in a
Yeah, that's
lot
right.
of different district courts. I mean, there's about at least 12 different courts that is it licensed to practice in, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean,
You have a lot of
licensed. I
you
mean,
have a lot of bona fides there, Elizabeth.
well, I mean, let's not pretend like it. Look, I got licensed in New York State and South Carolina State. So those are the ones that I had to actually sort of sit for a bar for. But
Right.
to get licensed in the Fourth Circuit or the Second Circuit or the Fifth, I mean, that's like literally giving them $250 and asking to be in the bar. Okay,
Well,
so
let's say
uh,
it like this. I mean, I'm trying to also not only shine the light a little bit that when as we go on with this interview, that people can know that you've had experience in a lot of different courts in a lot of different
yeah,
situations, and
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 I do
and that's what
appreciate
I think
that.
is important. Well, I think it's important because some people might see you as, when you start talking about the cases, they might say, well, this person is trying to get a criminal off, that they can be able to use their Second Amendment rights. There's a lot of Second Amendment people that are not absolutist. They're very Second Amendment, but they believe that, hey, the laws in the books are the laws in the books, and and that's it. And then there's some people that say there's gray areas in here, and
That's right.
then there's attorneys like yourself that are saying, hey, there are some gray areas, and some of these people deserve a second chance because maybe it wasn't violent, and maybe,
Hmm.
and so should violence or death be the bar to which your Second Amendments go to, but not beyond that. And that's where I think that you're showing these different gray areas in a way that can help, one, preserve Second Amendment rights, because the further we
Hmm.
move that bar backwards, the more people that lose their rights. And you're kind of
Hmm.
almost like you're saying, hey, I'm going to stop. I'm going to put a wall here. It might look like I'm in that gray area protecting somebody that used to be a criminal, but in essence, you may be stopping that encroachment of our Second Amendment rights, lowering the
Yeah.
bar.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, this is sort of a good example. You may have somebody in the federal criminal justice system who is charged with, distributing a drug, an illegal drug, and also having a firearm in their possession during the commission of this other crime. So
Hmm.
why is that two crimes and not just one? And when you analogize it to like the First Amendment right, so let's just say that you're breaking into a house, but at the same time you're saying, I hate the president. Why is that two crimes?
I see. I
Why
get you,
isn't it
right.
just a crime? Why isn't it just breaking into the why is a protected First Amendment or Second Amendment right criminalized? Just, I mean, while just because you're
Yeah, I see
talking
it.
about constitutional conduct. I mean, criminalize what's criminal, and
Right.
so that's the kind of over policing and that as somebody who's in the criminal defense area kind of offends me, and so that's part of why I'm doing this too. I mean, I've got a client who is accused of you know the sort of straw purchasing, smuggling guns across state
Right.
lines,
Right.
and then there's also the drug component. Well, that should just be one crime.
I see
Um,
what you're saying. Right. And
and
while
it
some
doesn't
people might look at you and say, here's an attorney trying to get a criminal, off the hook, and or maybe out of jail or lower their sentence. But in essence, I think that the positive, and again, I'm not advocating for criminals to own guns as much as I'm advocating for you to explain where or show where these blurred lines are, and that's what you're talking about. I mean, at some point you can say, "Hey, I'm a criminal. I'm helping these criminals get a second chance. I'm giving them their right to due process."
that's
And
right.
in the meantime, hey, guess what? Our Second Amendment is constantly getting under attack, and this is just another way. So let's talk about Fred a little bit. Can we go into a little bit more detail on Fred to kind of give people
Yeah.
an example of this 2255 and what's
Mhm.
happening with Fred?
Yeah, so Fred is from New York State originally, and he grew up in the projects. And so, in I'm sorry, in New York law, they have a crime called like criminal possession of a gun, second degree. And all that means is that he was outside of his home with a loaded gun. Like that's all it takes to be guilty of that crime. So he was living in the projects and he was arrested for that offense. No criminal activity associated with it. I mean, it was simply the gun charge, but it was a felony conviction. And so that made him incapable of legally possessing or bearing a firearm.
Can I stop you for
So
1 second?
mhm,
So I'm dissecting this a little bit. So it tells me is because New York's gun laws were so restrictive and the bar was
mhm,
so low that here you have somebody who's never been in trouble before. All they did is walk outside their house with a loaded
mhm,
weapon, and now they have a felony. And what
mhm,
gets and what I appreciate what you're doing is that now that person who's a felon is gonna have a
mhm,
harder time getting a job. They're gonna have a
mhm,
harder time advancing in life. They're gonna have a hard
mhm,
time getting, through society because they are now a felon off of a
right,
restrictive gun law that
mhm.
okay, so I'll keep on going.
I mean, and
We
that's exactly right. I
yeah.
mean, and that conviction is so old, there really is no remedy for, like, getting back into court to challenge it. I mean,
So
that's sort of the
obviously
second.
now Fred gets a slap. Now the path takes him to a road where he's got to decide how he's going to feed his family, support himself, live a life, and possibly make good or
Yeah.
bad decisions.
Well, I mean, so he ends up, sort of in the criminal milieu. I mean, and I'm not saying that he's a saint, that has
Right,
never been
exactly.
my but so he goes into an adjoining state where he purchases firearms there. He finds straw purchasers. He finds people who actually can purchase the
Mhm.
firearms legally at a much lesser price, right? And they can buy them. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how easy it is in New York State to kind of walk into a store and buy a gun anyway. But he
Right.
travels to a different state where he can do so less expensively and with less hassle. So he takes those guns and he takes them back up to New York where he sells them. So he also has some drugs. He's also dealing some drugs down in this adjoining state. So he is charged with the drugs and then the straw purchasing stuff. And he's convicted on both. And, I'm not challenging the drug conviction, okay? But the reason why he's doing as much time as he's doing, and the reason why the reason why it is a federal offense is because of this firearm, that he's kind of
Mhm.
taking the firearms back and forth across state lines. And that, just sort of the underlying reason for that felony just strikes me as so improper and unjust. And
Mhm.
now, I mean, it's just a sort of cascading effect, right, of
Mhm.
these criminal convictions kind of based on what initially is an incredibly restrictive gun law. So I'm not saying that this guy needs to go home tomorrow, all right?
Right.
I'm just saying that he ought not to be doing this much time for this conduct.
And what's interesting to me is this is more about the Second Amendment violation or the Second Amendment violation depending on which way you look at it against him or because of him is really just a parallel note to what you're trying to do with trying to get him, basically out of the system, back on his feet, so to speak, and the gun rights is just kind of a parallel note. Is that right?
I mean, I think that's right, but, I mean, like, I've got another kid in North Carolina, no criminal record, none. And then he picks up, it's sort of a drug charge, and then he gets, like, the gun along with the drugs, okay? But this is his first, like, foray into all this. And so because of the gun, he gets an additional 5 years. So this kid goes from what would have been like a 5-year sentence on the drugs to a 10-year sentence, mandatory minimum, because of that gun for somebody who had no prior criminal history. And so for a kid who's like in his 20s, that just seems awfully harsh. I mean,
It's
it's a
it
5-year charge.
right.
It's a 5-year charge. It is
And
not a 10-year charge.
and what you're kind of saying is instead of having one sentence on top of the other sentence, it's kind of like serve both of them at the same time. I mean, if you're slapping with a felony when he's out of jail that he can't, he's limited anyway, why hurt him more with 10 years and when 5 years will do because he's facing the sentence for the rest of his life after he gets out of jail? Is that a kind of a way to look at it?
Well, I mean, so the crime here is that he was dealing the drugs. He
Right.
also happened to have a firearm, but he didn't brandish it on anyone. He didn't, I mean, it was in the house where he was. I mean, but he didn't pull it on anyone. He's not walking around like, threatening people with guns. I mean, the gun is just a sort of afterthought. I mean, they charged him with it because they could.
Right.
And they charged him with it because they wanted a bigger sentence for him. But he had
And
the
he
right to have a gun for
it,
self-defense. It was inside a
it,
home even.
it was at his home
It was a home where he was then residing.
living.
So yes.
So,
Yeah.
so this is kind of what I wanted to point out in this interview. While I'm not advocating for criminals to have the right to own guns, I'm also showing the blurred lines and the attack on the Second Amendment. And in this case, if he's not using the gun, it's not a violent offense, but they're
Right.
removing his Second Amendment right for the rest of his life. When he gets out, he's no longer able to be able to defend himself when the reality is he was young, made a bad decision, got off on the wrong
Right.
foot, they're slapping him with a crime that is a violation of his constitutional rights. And then again, how far back do you have to go with this? Is this something that you're going to be able to argue in for today's laws in the books, or are you going to have to show, hey, before 1791, there was no justification for if you found somebody doing a crime in their home that you had the right to take their gun rights away. Am I making sense, or am I on the right track?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, and kind of the point that you keep kind of going back to is, I mean, so what were the restrictions, back in
Right.
the 1790s? I mean, who couldn't own firearms? Because there are, I mean, first of all, people who committed crimes were not forbidden from being able to possess firearms for
Mhm.
self-defense. I mean, now that probably did not apply to like capital offenses.
Right.
Um, but I mean, that's just sort of a different analysis. I mean, it certainly wasn't everyone. The people who could not own firearms back at the time of the framers' existence were Catholics and were people who they suspected of political insurrection, which is really
Wait,
sort of why the Catholics.
Catholics were not allowed to own guns back then?
No.
Really? I never knew that.
Yeah, I mean, so Catholics were sort of discriminated against. I mean, no one really trusted them, right? I mean, they're like the Catholics, they're sort of scared that they're gonna, kind of take over America and all the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, so
They might not
that
allow you to eat meat on a Friday. Yeah.
um, but so those were the kinds of things. I mean, like if they thought that you were going to, um, sort of rise up against the government, you were not allowed to possess guns. But they also had these, laws about people kind of going out to the forest, right? Like you couldn't take, um, sort of livestock and vegetables and fruits from certain the king's land and things like that. I mean, that's from back in England, and there's always been like sort of laws tending to kind of outlaw people who are gathering in groups like out in the woods sort of away from society, like, and it all kind of goes back to this idea of insurrection. And the Americans at the beginning of our existence were kind of rightly concerned about that. I mean, having just concluding a revolutionary war with England. um, but those were the kind of things that were outlawed, not these general, oh, you're a felon, therefore you can't own a firearm. I mean, that was just
Right.
never a part
It
of
was
the history of this country.
it was not as broad sweeping as that. It was more specific of the crime. If you do this, then or you have done this, then you're not going to be allowed to have a gun. Have the right to self-defense, basically. And I want to get back to your Fred case because in just a minute here, because I really want to focus that this is not one issue. There are how many? I mean, I'm sure you have no idea how many people are in the system like this. You've already in this given two examples of how many
Yeah.
people in the system losing their gun rights
Oh, yeah.
on non-violent crimes that should not, or at their youthful age or however. But at what point do you think is the bar where a criminal should lose their gun rights? Do you have one?
I mean, so I mean, I can kind of speculate. I mean, I can sort of spitball and
Right.
maybe come up. I mean, they're obviously violent people. We don't want to have guns. We don't
You
want
can't, right.
people who think are going to imminently place other people in danger. I mean, we all want that. Um, I think we may all be able to agree on some mental health issues. Um, but we just always have to be so careful, right? I mean, because once you start saying, "Oh, the people who are dangerous or the people who are not virtuous," I mean, and that's sort of a big argument, right?
Right.
That
Exactly. Right.
that only virtuous people could have guns. I mean, like once we start, I mean, those are just such broad and amorphous kinds of definitions. I mean,
Mhm.
we just have to be careful that we're not excluding people who have unpopular political views, who are out of favor with the political status quo. I mean, so dangerous, but exactly how we define dangerous is something that's just going to take some real thought.
Well, you hit on something earlier, which actually is I'm going to add to my next question that I had for you. What you talked about First Amendment rights, and let's talk about vote. Let's throw voting rights in there. So basically, someone goes, gets a felony charge, spend time in jail, they get out, they lose their voting rights also. So we're talking about your right to self defense, but when you're talking
Mhm,
about some of these non-violent criminals, who are
mhm,
getting slapped with gun violations, like the case of this North Carolina one you mentioned, where there's a
mhm,
20-year-old who's dealing drugs, there just happens to be a gun in the house. Now, not only is he losing his right to self-protection for the rest of his life, he's losing his right to vote. I mean,
Mhm.
you're basically taking somebody and saying, "Okay, you've done your time, but we're gonna make you an outcast of society. You'll never be able to protect yourself. You'll never have a say with our government." I mean, what's next? Their First Amendment right, which
I mean,
is
it's called civil death. I mean, when you have been convicted of a felony, you experience civil death. So you are no longer able to own or possess a firearm. You're not allowed to vote anymore. You cannot hold public office. There are a number of different livelihoods that you might otherwise be qualified for that you will never get licensed in because of these convictions. You will not be eligible for student loans. You will be kicked out of certain government subsidized housing. I mean, once you have a felony conviction in America, I mean, you are screwed.
and see
And
this is go ahead.
and I've just had sort of you know, in this line of work, I've just sort of seen where this leads. I mean, we haven't even started talking about like civil forfeiture, when the government is also sort of taking
Right.
all of your money and you never get out from under that. And,
And
I've had,
they've got unlimited funds to fight you while you have very
oh,
limited
yeah,
funds to fight, and meanwhile, you're losing every right in
every,
our Constitution. And so this is why this is like I said, on the outside, when I decided to wanna interview you, I said, some people are gonna perceive this as, here's this person just trying to get criminals free and give them their guns back, and I looked at it as just like we're talking about. Once these bars that our government keeps lowering the bar, for who violates the crime, and I'm not going to argue what laws are just and what laws aren't. You're basically not only, like you said, kicking somebody out of society, but at the same time, many of these people deserve a second chance. And
mhm,
if we don't, and if attorneys like you weren't fighting it, then government keeps lowering that bar more and more and more, and more people in society, as in the case of Fred in New York, start
mhm,
gets walks outside with a loaded gun. The 20-year-old
mhm,
makes a bad decision, first offense, drugs, and there's a gun in the house. And are those just two examples of what, millions probably, whether whatever point of time you're measuring. But it goes back to some things I always talk about on my show. When
mhm.
the unintended consequences of government rules and regulations destroy and hurt aspects of our society in such a way that they can't recover, and more frequently than not, it's the poor, it's
Oh,
minorities, it's
yeah. Mhm.
underprivileged people, and and
Yes.
and then we go, oh well, that's these policies. Well, and again, while those people are suffering. So, what would you say about all this? I know I'm kind of rambling a little
Yeah,
bit, but you have me
no,
fired
I
up.
mean, no, I
I'm
know. I mean,
excited
I
because not only you protected Second Amendment, you're you're showing how these rules can encroach on our First Amendment, our voting rights, whatnot.
I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, and once you make it so that somebody is, I was, kind of like a pariah in our society. I mean, how do you expect that person to kind of reintegrate? You're making it so this person can't even get a job, and
Right.
then and then you want to complain because your tax dollars are going to support people who are indigent. I mean,
Right.
you are taking away their ability to make a living and then blaming them for not making a living. And I just get really, I mean, I get fired up about it too because I just sort of see this, and for a lot of people, it's just a real catch-22, and it happens when they're young. I mean, you've got a kid who's like 20 who gets like saddled with this, and you're making it virtually impossible for him to ever like get back into society and make something of himself.
Right.
And that's why, as much as this, I mean, I do support some gun restrictions.
Mm,
Um, but I don't have any problem at all challenging these
right.
convictions for the,
Well, no,
for these
and a lot
for
of and most what I find is most responsible gun owners, most responsible, I say most, all responsible gun. It's kind of a we always say all responsible gun owners support the laws that are in the books, whether they like them or don't like them. They respect the laws on the books. But in
Mhm.
your case, and the reason why, again, why I'm bringing this on is because you're showing that, hey, some of the laws on the book or some of the gray areas of making bad decisions, that are nonviolent, it should not affect them for the rest of their lives, based
Right.
what's on the books.
Yeah.
And how many clients like this have you helped?
I mean, I gotta tell you, when Bruin came out, I told my husband this. I was like, "Oh my god, it's gonna be an avalanche. It's going to be an avalanche." And it is. I mean,
Now,
like, I'm getting
is it
I've
avalanche because attorneys see it as an opportunity to overturn, or is it an avalanche because the people in jail are realizing, hey, I could get a second chance if this is overturned? Now,
well, if we can get a second chance. I mean, so this is kind of I mean, this is all, we're all sort of doing the best that we can. But there are a lot of people. I mean, you when you look at the federal criminal justice system, I mean, you just would be shocked to know like how often they use firearms to either obtain their convictions or get their enhanced sentences. It's in almost every single case. And so when you start to think about the number of people who could be impacted by a new construction of the Second Amendment and how that's going to kind of play out in the criminal justice field, we're talking about a very large number of people.
right.
Um, and so I've got two phone calls today from potential clients who are looking at raising kind of Bruin challenges to their federal convictions. And I can just look, online on Pacer and kind of pull a couple of documents and know that at least this one guy's got a really good claim. I don't know about the other one, and I'd like to get more documents and all the rest of it, but it,
Do you
there's just
think
a
we
lot
talked about this?
out there.
We talked about this a minute ago, and again, it sounds almost outlandish to say that voting rights and of course First Amendment rights are could be violated while we're talking about guns. And of course, guns are bad, right? That people always say guns are bad, and the crimes are bad. That usually the people that are convicted of these gun crimes are doing drugs. They're not making great decisions or doing bad things. But do you think that the slippery slope is that if the government starts realizing how much they can convict or put people away for something that's as obviously harmful as guns or drugs, or in this case that it could be lead to First Amendment right violations? I mean, it's already voting rights, but you could lead to First Amendment right violations.
I mean, we've got a pretty robust sort of body of law on the First Amendment, and a lot of that goes back to the 60s and before, with war protests and all the rest of it. Like, I feel like, I mean, there's always going to be some movement around the margins, but we're pretty
Mhm.
good on First Amendment stuff. Why this is different is because we really haven't had much Second Amendment jurisprudence. I
Mhm.
mean, for a long time, the court just wouldn't take the cases. And then Heller came along, and then McDonald came along. But it's been like 10 years since we've had a Second Amendment case. That's why Bruin is just such a
Right.
monumental event because I mean, we're about to start seeing just a lot more movement here.
What about
So
there was a Chevron case too a while back, wasn't there?
is Chevron, yeah. So are you talking about sort of Chevron deference when we're talking about
Right.
administrative agencies and
Right.
I mean that's actually sort of another issue that's percolating in the federal criminal context as well. When we have Congress comes out with sort of I mean they pass our statutes, right? I mean that's what they do, they make statutes.
Right.
Then there's also this federal sentencing commission which interprets these statutes, and so you get
Right.
all these books. Here's what Congress really
Right.
meant. Um, but Congress doesn't always
What
really mean what the Federal Sentencing Commission says it means. And so now there's this. So the United States Supreme Court came out with the name of the case I think is Kaiser v. Wilkie. And again, that's another one. It's like the Chevron deference issue only
Mhm.
for criminal stuff. So I mean, it's just a big issue, and that
And
is also going
what's
to have.
interesting, you brought up Congress, but some of these a lot of these laws aren't coming out of Congress, they're coming from the alphabet agencies. And so while we rely on Congress to make our laws, There's a lot of these, of course, after FDR, all the alphabet agencies comes along, and now we're dealing with, and that's the other reason why I wanted to bring you on and talk about this, because the quagmire between what's in our Constitution, what Congress has passed, and then what the alphabet agencies since then have created as mandates and regulations that people are going to jail for, which I think is the web that you're trying to untangle here when you fight these things on these 2255s.
Definitely policies, So, I mean, when you talk about your alphabet agencies, I look at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We got Merrick Garland now. We've had Jeff Sessions. We had William Barr. And, every time we get like a new attorney general, they come in with like different prosecution, priorities. And that just has a really huge effect on, I mean, how people are treated. When
Mhm.
Jeff Sessions came in, I mean, he said, look, I want all line prosecutors to try to obtain the most serious offense that there is evidence to support. And so, you had a lot of prosecutors who like, I can't drop this gun charge. I can't do
Right.
this. We've got the session and that's why I have to look for,
Right.
15 years for this person. Um, and now we've got sort of the Merrick Garland memo that came out in December, which, sort of pulls back on that and says, before you are looking for a mandatory minimum, look to see whether or not there's really sort of, a federal interest that's going to be advanced by this. So it's a different approach.
And I like with what you're doing, it kind of pushes back on that. And
Yes.
it's kind of pushing back on as I said, on the bar constantly being lower. We've talked about Bruin a couple of times. Do you think Bruin was too broad?
Um, I mean, it's a new test, right? I mean, so whether it's I mean, it applies to everything.
Yeah.
So it is what it is. And I mean, you have to know that the justices of the Supreme Court are pretty smart people. So they knew that this was going to open up some floodgates. Now, whether or not they've got this all sort of figured out ahead of time and where they think they're going to go with this, I mean, we know where like Amy Coney Barrett probably wants to go, right? I mean, because
Right.
you read the Cantor v. Barr case,
Exactly
and
right. Yeah.
he's not prepared to say that white collar criminals can't own firearms. Like that just sort
Mhm.
of seems to be where she's at.
Right.
And I imagine there are probably a number of others on the court who feel that same way as well. And I certainly feel that way. I mean, I'll tell you right now, I mean, I've got two physicians who are convicted felons and now cannot own firearms. I have a former
Yeah.
sheriff who is no longer allowed to own or possess a firearm. I mean, it's absurd. It's
Well, that's
absurd.
like one of the cases that we're talking about, Heller and Bruin. One of those guys was a DC cop and could
I
not
think that
have a
must have
firearm.
been
What's that?
right. I said that must have
And
been the
so
Heller. Yeah.
yeah. So when you look at how broad and overreaching some of the laws are from the alphabet agencies, or that are governing who can own a firearm, it doesn't decide against criminals who some people think, oh well, they're from, I want to say the hood, but they're from the bad part of town and they were doing drugs, so they deserve it. You're now saying that there are doctors and even sheriffs that have not been able to have their gun, or have had their gun rights taken away because of
Mhm,
some of these laws that are being woven into the fabric of our country that you're trying to unweave in
mhm.
some of your cases.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, that's right. I mean, we've just for some reason, we decided that anyone who is convicted of a felony can no longer own or possess a firearm. That law came into existence back in, like, 1968. So that came
Mhm.
into existence, like, before we had this age of mass incarceration. We had that on the books before we went from 300,000 people in prison to over 2,000,000. I
Right.
mean, the number of people who have been disqualified from owning firearms, as well as losing the right to vote or the right to get loans for school and all the rest of those collateral consequences. I mean, that has just ballooned. Just uh, it's just an
Yeah.
inexplicable man. I mean, it has just been exponential growth of people who are no longer able to function as citizens in our country. And it is just, I mean, it's a real problem. I had this conversation with, some of my colleagues. It's like, 40 years got us here. Where are we going to be in another 40 years? I mean, we are just throwing everyone in prison. We are giving everyone these, these sentences and these scarlet letters
Right.
that are really impacting the ability of our democracy to function. And I just think it's time for significant pushback on that.
I have to tell you, when I originally thought about interviewing you, and I originally, started researching some of the topics, and I was gonna go deeper in the 2255, in some of these cases, and I want to give you that chance because I do think that people need to know what you do to help people. But this conversation is kind of going in a slightly different direction, which I have appreciated actually more than I thought I would, in how much it affects our society afterwards. Because look, I'm a law-abiding citizen that doesn't want the bad guys to have guns. I want to respect the gun laws on the books, but I never even really thought how much it affects our society until you've talked about this. Because now, when you look at, like I said, they've lost the right to vote, so now mentally they're out of touch with politics. They don't even care what goes on. So now they are citizens that are not participating in our democracy. And some people
That's right.
might say, well, criminals shouldn't. But when you talk about some of the ones who, should, I mean, and it sounds like
Mhm.
many of them should still be able to participate because
Many.
their conviction was so low, was so, the bar was so low on their convictions. And then you talk about how now they're not even, in society anymore. They can't borrow money. They can't get a job. Now we wonder why crime is so high in our country, because so many of these people are out on the streets and communities, and their only option is to continue being criminals, and
That's
they can't
exactly
get
right.
their life better. And
They've been
again, we're being
excluded from professions. I mean, they've been excluded from civil life. I mean, and when you
yeah.
exclude people from civil life, I mean, why are you surprised they're not acting civilly? Why they're acting in ways that are destructive to the community? It's because you know, they've been just thrown out of the
Right,
community.
exactly. So yeah, so that's why I can appreciate more. So let's talk a little bit more, because we'll start wrapping up here in a few minutes, and talk about how you do a lot. Are you focused just on the 2255s, or or is it more criminal defense that you do?
Yeah, I mean, so my particular space is doing like appeals. I do criminal appeals, and so that's brought me into kind of the federal post conviction. A lot of these Bruin challenges that we're bringing are, they're done on the pleadings. I do a brief, and then we get it submitted, and we get opinions in those cases. So I kind of sort of fell into it. But that's my space. I mean, I'm sure there are lawyers out there who are also doing more of the sort of frontline litigation, challenging, particular statutes and, municipalities and states on regulations kind of based on Bruin. So I'm sure that that's going on too. It just, I just became sort of aware of it because I saw pretty soon, pretty quickly, how this was going to have an impact on guys who were already convicted of federal offenses. And so that's where I'm trying to kind of help them out right now. That's just sort of my own little piece of the pie. But I mean,
Yeah,
I think there's a
I've
lot
been having your website scroll at the bottom so people can, if they have these issues or know somebody that
more.
does. But so what came first? And it's the old chicken and the egg story, right? What came first? Of course, when you went to law school, you probably had a desire for law, or desire, to be an attorney. But was it an appreciation of the Constitution? Or after you became an attorney and you see how many people, some people practice all kinds of different laws, or law rather. So when you
Mhm.
became an attorney and did you start seeing how people's rights are violated? What got you into that space?
Yeah.
And then was that when you really, the appreciation for Constitution came into, like, our constitutional rights sunk in?
So, I mean, my background's in philosophy, right? So I've just always kind of been interested in, philosophy and philosophy adjacent things like political science and
Mhm.
economics. I went off to law school and, really kind of initially thought I was going to be a prosecutor. But I got a job at a public defender office and in their appellate division, and it just fit like a glove. And, all I can say is it has been the privilege of my lifetime to be able to kind of walk into a courtroom and raise a little hell and just, take on the government.
Yeah.
It appeals to my sort of libertarian sense, that I kind of
Yeah.
grew up with. And I mean, sometimes it just feels good to pick a fight. And it's always deeply satisfying for me to pick a fight on behalf of people who are incapable of picking fights by themselves.
Right.
You know, so it's been a really great ride. And a lot of people don't enjoy being lawyers. They think it's really stressful, and I mean, it definitely has that part of it. But there is just nothing like walking into a courtroom and representing a citizen.
Yeah,
Somebody,
exactly.
you're representing somebody against just the power and the force of the government. And it's pretty awe-inspiring, really. I just
And most people when they think when they meet somebody like you that's talk about civil rights or people's rights, they think in terms politically as somebody who's more left leaning, and that's not a question, but but they think of that. But when I listen to you, and you're talking about not just criminals, both white collar crime and of course the more heinous ones like we talked about earlier. And I said not even heinous, but just more criminal activity kind of thing. You really your desire to fight for constitutional rights really stands
Mhm.
out, and
Yeah.
that's one reason I appreciate you. I hope to have you on again. One question as I just now kind of going back over my notes and thinking was there's a Jamie Catano case that involved a stun gun.
Hmm.
Do you know about that one?
No,
Because that
I don't know what that is.
That I want you to look that one up because
Mhm.
when we earlier when we were talking about pre 1791, um,
Mhm,
she's
mhm,
somebody that's getting a felony for having a stun gun to protect herself against an ex boyfriend that used to beat
mhm,
her, and and
mhm.
and so they got her for having a stun gun, which
Right.
fits in with all these other cases that you're talking about where the bar gets lowered so
Mhm.
much, that our constitutional rights get trampled on.
Well, there are numbers. I mean, the statute that I was talking about earlier is just sort of the felon in possession of a firearm. But that
Mhm,
particular statute makes a number of other things, illegal, and those are also being challenged. So, for
mhm,
example, the possession of ghost guns, the possession of high capacity magazines, the prohibition of people who have alcohol or mental health issues from owning and possessing firearms. So there are kind of a number of the restraining orders. So there are a number of different sort of elements of that statute, and I mean the challenges are all over the place. I just happen to have a lot where I happen to kind of be in that felon in possession space. I mean, that's just where I'm seeing a lot of my cases. But, a number of those regulations are being challenged.
I have an easy question for you. And I ask everybody this on my interviews. I believe that our country has gotten so divided. Our country's divided on narratives and ideologies and
Yeah.
rights and everything, and we're just everybody's looking at political landscape. And I mean, I even tell people, I mean, look, just because I might say one thing, I like to shine the light on a lot of different things. We'll put it that way. And so
Mhm,
I'm always looking for the things that unites us.
mhm,
I always try to find even the people that I have the biggest differences with, which aren't many because I get along with just about everybody.
mhm.
But I always ask people, in your opinion, what unites us as Americans? What are things that we can do to strive to help each other and unite more people to be able to improve our country?
I mean, I think one thing that everyone has in common is that we all sort of love our children and want our children to
Yeah, yeah,
have better lives.
right.
And, I mean, I think that sometimes I wish we would kind of get out of our own sort of wants and needs and just kind of think about what it would take to create a world for our kids that we want them to have, frankly.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that sounds a little kumbaya-ish, but
No, actually, I'm a comment on that because I love the answer. No,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
I just think everyone loves children. They love their children, and if we can just
Well,
sort
you
of
know what?
respect that other people are trying to do the best for their kids as we're trying to do for ours, and try to seek solutions there, I think that would be good.
What I think is important about that answer, which by the way, no one's ever said that. It's funny. I ask that question a lot, and I get all these different answers, and a lot of them overlap. That's the first time someone's ever said their children. And and what comes to my mind when you say that, and why I have so much respect for that answer, is if everybody thought about the future of our children, if everybody put our children as a priority, we'd have less crime. We'd
Yeah.
have we'd have we'd have more a better work ethic in our communities. We'd have people thinking more
Better
about each other,
healthcare,
better health care. We'd have
better
more people
education,
focused. What's that?
better education opportunities.
Exactly. And and
Mhm.
and our society would be better as a whole. And what I like what you're doing with this criminal defense stuff that you're working on that we've talked about is now you're not only thinking of other people first and you're putting your family first and you're spreading the word of thinking of our children first and that sentiment, but you're also saying, look, we got to pave the way for our society to improve on these things. And I like that. I appreciate that. Well,
Right.
Elizabeth, any parting words? Now, after you have parting words, and I end our broadcast, I do want to talk to you off camera for a minute. Do you have any
Sure.
parting words before we end the show?
No, I just think it's just a really great forum. I mean, I really appreciate the idea of kind of bringing people from maybe different kind of political sort of backgrounds and just trying to find some common ground. I mean, I just think that's the only way that anything will ever get better. So I
I think
appreciate your forum.
I appreciate your time. I think that's exactly what you did. I mean, you showed how, sometimes criminal justice doesn't have to be what the narrative is against it. It can be saying, hey, sometimes defending the criminal, somebody might label a criminal, it might be defending rights for everybody or
Exactly right.
stop lowering that bar and setting that wall. Elizabeth, thank
Mhm.
you so much. I really appreciate it. Everybody, please share the show, share the interview. This will be on a podcast on all podcast apps the next couple of days. And I'll have it on my YouTube account. I'll have it on my Rumble account. Check it out there. Thank you all so much and have a great day.